Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Andreas. I'm a student at Oxford University. I was a part of an initiative where some students went to the Calais refugee camp called the Jungle in March for a few days to volunteer and act as interpreters. And I've also been there during the summer for 2 weeks to volunteer and to conduct some research with some refugees. I should ask before I speak about the jungle, has anybody here been to the Calais refugee camp? So a few. So I might just introduce it quickly first before I talk about what one can do about the situation there in Calais at the moment. So like I said, I don't represent any particular organization. I've just been there as a private citizen myself. In the Calais camp there have been refugees in Calais for over a decade. The current camp, which is called the Jungle, has been there for a few years. There's about 9,000 people there at the moment, although on Monday the camp is going to be demolished by French authorities, so we're not entirely sure how the numbers are. From the people I've been speaking to who are there at the moment, tell that many refugees are leaving the camp, so the numbers are probably a bit lower than 9,000. Of the 9,000, over 1,000 are children. Many of them are unaccompanied, and this has been, of course, in the news the last few days because there has been some changes where Britain is beginning to admit, I think, 14 lone children from the camp. So I don't want to, so when I was in the camp, I don't want to describe necessarily the situation and speak on behalf of refugees for what they've been going through, because it's very hard to actually, I think, understand and speak about what it is like to be in a dirty, dangerous, and depressing place that the jungle is. It's an unrecognized, unofficial refugee camp, which means that all the volunteers who are working there, all the humanitarian initiatives are completely organized by charities that are doing this on their own. So there's no oversight and no real accountability. There is, the French authorities are present in the gendarmerie, which more or less are guarding Calais from the refugees and the refugees from a situation in which they are living in basically an anarchy with 10,000 people, or 9 to 10,000 people, which is, of course, a small town. And you can imagine how it is when you have that many people, most of them lone men, young men who have come from horrible conditions and who are often on drugs and who are often very bored and have very little to do with their time. So the situation is quite horrendous. The most horrendous thing, of course, one sees in the camp are the children, the youngest of which charity estimates that their youngest ones are 8 years old, but there have been children born in the camp, and have been children that are younger than 8 years old. I met a 16-year-old boy who has been 2 years in the camp, and he is a stateless person and who should have the right to apply for asylum in the UK, which recognizes his statelessness. But because he cannot make it to the UK, he's basically stranded in the Calais refugee camp. So I think the matter of most urgency with regards to the camp at the moment is, of course, the unaccompanied children, which should be admitted to the UK, in which they could apply for asylum, under which they have the right to do so. Of course, there are two main legal pathways to do this. There's the Dublin 3 EU law, basically, in which is about family reunification. So children who have family in the UK should be able to come here. As of, to the best of my knowledge, as of this past week, the UK has admitted about 70 children under that scheme, which has been described as, acting with urgency and acting with, has been seen as a good result by the Home Secretary. There's another legal framework, which is the Dubs Amendment, and they're similarly named, which is a bit confusing, but the Dubs Amendment is an amendment to the Immigration Act, which means that the UK promises to admit unaccompanied minors who may not have any family in the UK, but who are basically lone children in various refugee camps. And there's no specific number set, but it would at least be in the thousands. To the best of my knowledge, at least as of this week, 0 children have been taken in under the Dubs Amendment, despite it being passed in May of this year. There are now, that being said, there are now lawyers and various teams who are in the camp who are trying to make lists of children. I saw the Home Secretary speak in Parliament on the 10th of October, and she was continuously asked about the numbers, how many children are coming, how many are there. There's a lot of confusion about this. The Home Secretary believes it's not useful to give public information on the numbers of children because it can be used by smugglers, who are the real villains, in her words, and who might profit somehow from knowing the amount of children in the camp. But now there are apparently an official move to count children for British authorities. Of course, people have been counting children since many years, but for some reason it hasn't really been, that information hasn't passed on to the responsible authorities who could be facilitating the admission of a few basically lonesome children. If one listens to the political debate about this between England and between the UK and France, there is a lot of blame going about on who is responsible and who is not acting up and who is not taking the initiatives. The UK blames France and France blames the UK, and it's all quite boring to figure out whose fault it is, but certainly we all have a responsibility for that situation. And it's an absolutely appalling failure of the authorities in the UK and France to help a few hundred, if nothing else, a few hundred children to start their lives and not live in these squalid conditions in the Calais refugee camp. So yeah, whenever I talk about the camp, it's all quite depressing, really, and I always think that I should somehow have, be positive and look on the bright side, but I think that would be actually doing a great injustice toward the people in the camp, because it isn't a bright situation. And even if there are now people being counted and a few dozen have been brought over, children only have been brought to the UK, it's essentially, we shouldn't speak euphemistically about this, because the Calais camp is, after all, just a small fraction of all the refugee situation in Europe. And even if it's horrendous, there is plenty of horrendous stories in other parts of Europe too. So I apologize for not having anything positive to say and to make you all depressed, but I think it's something that we need to acknowledge and deal with, and not wave that away. So I thought I'd also talk a bit about what you can do as a private person if you are not active in a group. I think we've heard, obviously, here from the past two speakers some really useful initiatives that you can take on different levels. I would maybe also add the trying to address the larger picture, which is, after all, to change the way we speak about refugees in this country and in Europe as a whole, to change the way our politicians are forced to deal with the issue and take some responsibility, not to succumb to populism and finding easy solutions that are easy to present in the media, but to actually deal with the wider problem. Because what's happening now, which has been written about in the press, is that if we take a few, maybe 100 children from the Calais refugee camp, we can forget about the rest of the people there. We can forget about all the adults or who range in various ages and who have been through horrendous experiences to end up in the squalor of Calais. We might forget about them, and we might think that we've done our part now, and now this is a matter for the French authorities to disperse them throughout the country. So I think that it's important that we one does pressure the MPs, that one does activate yourself and inform yourself, so that whenever you do something about the situation, even how small it might be, you're doing so with an informed mind and having thought about the issue. I think perhaps more concrete, what has been a useful thing to do for the Calais situation has been to help out in some way, no matter how small it is, if it's organizing for a container to be shipped over, if it's about visiting the camp and helping out in any capacity, if it's about getting involved with some of the telephone campaigns where you can call and speak to refugees, and just for as a social activity. As I said, one of the biggest problems in the camp has been boredom, where people essentially have nothing to do and can't leave the camp, so they just sit around and often are forced to basically resort to taking drugs. So all of these small things matter beyond the fact that they might occupy someone's time for 5 minutes. It also means that when you have yourself done something, your friends and family hear about that, they can see a concrete example of something that a normal person who might not have the time or means to engage with this issue on a full-time basis or for several hours a week. But even showing that you are doing something, no matter how small it is, I feel has been, for me at least, the thing that has stimulated most of my friends to also do something, no matter how small. I've just been about 2 weeks, like I said, in the Calais camp, and some of the people I met there had been for 1 day, some people had been for 2 days, some people had been for over 6 months. And I think we shouldn't feel, as private citizens or individuals, we shouldn't feel that we are comparing ourselves to how much effort we put in or not, or how futile it might be. I think the point is that you try to stimulate within your social circle and within the contacts you have a sense that if you do something, it also raises awareness for the issue, which is, it might sound as a very simple and unsatisfying, with regards to the complexity of the issue, it might seem like an unsatisfying effort to undertake, but actually, if one does read the newspapers, the first day of when these 14 children, unaccompanied children, coming from war zones, came to this country, most of the national media was treating them like cattle and discussing if we should measure their teeth or not to determine how old they were, and maybe they were just, actually using the British system to come to this country. So I think we have a huge uphill if one cares about the lives of people who are living among us, but in completely different terms, without any rights or means to a basic decent human life. If one does care about that, then I think it's important to even take those small baby steps and contribute to the national discussion about the issue. I think perhaps, I think that, I'm happy to answer any questions about what I, from the camp itself. But like I said, I think it's enough to say that one can imagine what happens in a situation where there is no future and there's a lot of despair and there's a lot of horrendous stories that people bring with them. And feel abandoned. And I think the one thing that also that one can do as a private citizen is when one does take an initiative and show that you care, it does actually register with people who live under these conditions. And even if it feels futile and you can't actually promise that you can help in any way, the fact that you show that you care matters a lot when the daily experience for several months of these people have often been subjected to violence from the securitization of the camp, violence at the hands of French police, violence at the hands of other refugees in the camp, and just a sense of complete alienation from the rich world in which they find themselves, but that doesn't care much about them. So yeah, thanks for that.